Good evening. My name is Evan Gregory, and this is Bible Answers. Tonight's topic, we're going to be looking at the canon of the New Testament. We're going to be looking at the history of it, and looking at the historical validity of it as well. I'm getting tongue tied there. As always, this is brought to you by the North Columbus Church of Christ, located in Columbus, Mississippi, and our website scrolling below me is northcolumbuschristians.com. Getting right into the lesson, I think a lot of times when people are looking at the New Testament or the Bible as a whole, that a lot of times they have in their mind that we have the King James Bible, and we know of that. So that was in the 1600s or thereabouts, which when it was created, and we have multiple versions after the King James Bible. But what was going on before the King James, and was there a gap between the King James Bible and the first century, and the writings we have from the first century? And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at some, really the arguments for the historical accuracy of the New Testament as well. And I hope this is useful for all of you. So go right into the lesson. When you think about the canon of the New Testament, that there is a lot of historical documents and or copies of either the entirety of the New Testament or parts of the New Testament. Much of it was being circulated for long periods of time. So as far as the manuscripts that we know of, and so this would be a manuscript that's a collection of the book of the New Testaments, that we have around 5,300 New Testament manuscripts, but we have thousands more of fragments, so pieces, so maybe just a part of one particular letter of the New Testament. And we have tens of thousands of these particular fragments for the New Testament and the Old Testament. And so again, this is not a situation where a select few were keeping up with the New Testament or the Bible, and they were keeping it under guard, under lock and chain, and only they could write copies of it or whatever it may be. Again, these what we see with this evidence is that there were plenty of copies being made, but a lot of people were making copies of this, and there's a lot of these fragments and a lot of these manuscripts floating around. And the one thing about that is, even though we have these multiple versions, which we will look at in a few minutes, that all of these versions, these copies, these fragments, they all closely agree with each other. What you don't see is wide variations in what is being said. There may be slight differentiations about how what maybe a verb or something along that lines just changed just slightly, but what you don't see is changings of the meanings of the scripture, that those are remaining consistent throughout these various manuscripts and these various documents. And so, going along with the lesson, we have a quote here from Sir Frederick Kenyon. And so he wrote this book called Our Bible and Ancient Manuscripts. And he says the number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations from it, and of quotations from it in the oldest writers of the church is so large that it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or other of these ancient authorities. This can be said of no other ancient book in the world. So, again, plenty of copies, plenty of translations of it, but also you see people in the past quoting the scriptures. And so you may have quotations from the second, third century. And so what this means is that these people, they knew of the scriptures, they read it and they memorized it, and they put that into their writings, during that time. And so again, it builds up the case for the validity of it, as this fella here said, that this type of validation cannot be said of any other ancient book in the world. And you think about the ancient books or stories we may read, You think about maybe of Homer's Odyssey or some of these other stories of that time. You think about maybe some of Shakespeare's plays or whatever it may be, of these things that are passed down through history that everybody just knows that Homer wrote it or Shakespeare wrote it or whoever it may be wrote it. But we assume that to be, and we just say, hey, this is it, this is fact. But yet they don't hold the same validity as the letters of the New Testament do. So it ought to cause us to ponder, if we're questioning whether or not the New Testament is accurate, and that the writings of the New Testament have been translated accurately throughout time. Well, again, as this fellow said, there's things they're going on with the scriptures here. There's validation here that can be said of no other book of that time period. And so we're going to look at a few main manuscripts. If you own a Bible and you read, sometimes there are footnotes that may reference different manuscripts, and you may read of a Vatican or Sinaitic manuscript. And so what we see here is that these three main manuscripts. We see the Vatican manuscript. It holds almost all of Greek Old Testament and the New Testament. And we see the Sinaitic manuscript, which is the oldest complete New Testament manuscript. So it dates to around the mid-4th century here. And then we also have the Alexandrian manuscript, which, as we see, is a mostly complete Old Testament and New Testament manuscript dating from around the 5th century. So notice that all of these manuscripts, they date from around the 4th to 5th century. There are a large collection of the writings of the Old and the New Testament as well. So we do have very old collection of the writings of our modern day Bible. We also have other, I would say, lesser known writings that are not these full-fledged manuscripts like we just looked at, but again builds the case for showing us that the scriptures, that they were around, they were circulated very early, and looking at all of this evidence, seeing how these other sources, how they are, or how accurate they are in comparison to the writings found in these other manuscripts. Do these writings match up with these manuscripts? Again, validate the message of the original letters. So there was this harmony of the Gospels it's called the Diatessaron. I'm not sure if that's how you say it or not, but it's said to be written around 170. And so this was written by a fellow named Tatian, which was a pupil of Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr may be a familiar name to all of you. But the thing is, even though it is said to be written around 170, we don't actually have original sources for that. But what we do have is that we have found, I say we, somebody found fragments of this Diatessaron that was in a Roman fortress around 256. And so, again, we're inching closer and closer to the time of Christ, to the time of the apostles. And so this harmony of the Gospels, this would be compiling the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and kind of writing I guess you would say, a chronological piecing together of all of these books together, so that they can tell the same story consistently, even though they were written by these four different authors here. And so again, we find it around the year 256, which is not that far from removed, relatively speaking, from the time of the apostles and the time of Christ here. So what we do see is that the Gospels were around at this time. And let's move on. We also have the old Syriac versions of the New Testament. And there's a few versions of this old Syriac. We see this, I believe it's called the Curetonian Syriac, which is a couple of the Gospels. And so this was around the 5th century. We also have the Sinaitic Syriac, which was a copy of the Gospels. And interesting enough, this was a copy that was at a monastery by the name of St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai. And so it dates to the 4th or 5th century as well. And then we also have this Peshitta version, which was a revision of the old Syriac text. And there's around 350 manuscripts of this version. So again, we see things dated from the 3rd century, 4th, 5th century of the Gospels or of other letters of the New Testament here. We also have the Coptic version, and so we have a Sahidic version, which is it's for I guess those of Upper Egypt. It's written in the dialect of Upper Egypt, and so we have these manuscripts that date to the 3rd or 4th centuries as well. We also have this Bohairic version, which dates to the 4th to 5th century. Okay, and so we see these different versions. So we have the Coptic version, we have the Syriac versions, we have all these other manuscripts. I guess you would say these main Vatican, the Sinaitic manuscripts as well. And what these other manuscripts do is they back up those main manuscripts by looking at the totality of all this evidence, looking at all these different versions. We can put them all together and say, okay, what are the differences? Is there major differences? Are there differences that would cause us to question the legitimacy of these versions or the legitimacy of the letters themselves? And so what we do see is that these versions, specifically here, the Coptic version, helps to confirm the text of the Vatican and the Sinaitic manuscript. And I haven't mentioned this before, but notice that these different versions, they're from different areas. These are people making copies in different parts of the world, but yet what we do see is that these versions they're all basically the same. They're all saying the same thing. We don't have a Coptic version that is a totally different translation, or saying, say for example, is saying that the book of Matthew is saying something totally different from what the Syriac version or what the Sinaitic manuscript may say. We see that they're all very, very similar. And so we also have an old Latin version. So we're starting to get closer and closer to our modern English versions. And so we don't have a copy, at least that I'm not aware of a quote old Latin version of the scriptures. But what we do see is that apparently there was an old Latin version based on early writings. Okay, and so what we have is this Bishop Damascus of Rome asked a fellow by the name of Jerome to revise this old Latin version here. Okay, so what we do see is that the old Latin version was there before Jerome's revision that we're going to look at here shortly. Okay, so there was something floating around in the Latin language before this revision here. And so the revision was the Latin Vulgate. And so all this is doing is just making the Latin translation more compatible with the original Greek. Okay, so just making it Greek closer to the original Greek language. And so what we do see is that Jerome, he finished revising this in 384. We see that again, this Vulgate, as it is called, aligns closely with the Vatican and Sinaitic manuscript. And so we see that very early, again, I push the point that very early, we see these manuscripts come to light. We see these translations come to light. Early 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries here. And again, going back, that we do know, even though we don't have original copies, we do have correspondence from these individuals that there was a need to do something different, to make a better translation from what was there currently. And so what we do know is that there was a translation somewhere there between the 1st and the 4th century when Jerome made his translations here. So looking at the English translations of the Bible, it is said, although we don't have copies of these scriptures, it is said that some of the parts of the Bible were translated in English. This Old English, these Old English versions, as they're called, in the 7th and 8th centuries. We do also have these Old English versions of the Pentateuch, so that would have been the first 5 books of the Bible. We also have parts of the Psalms and the Gospels, but we don't see a complete, or at least what we don't have in our possession, a complete translation, English translation, until John Wycliffe's translation in 1382 here. And so after this, we do see where, as time goes on, as technological advances are made, that we're starting to see more and more English translations. So we see Erasmus, and he prints the first Greek New Testament in 1516. Okay, and so they prints it in Greek. We see William Tyndale translates the Greek into English. So now William Tyndale is translated in English New Testament, and he completes this in 1526 with also other editions in 1534 and 1535. And so for whatever reason, the Catholics didn't like what William Tyndale was doing. They didn't, if I remember correctly, they didn't really like people or regular people getting their hands on these English translations of the Bible. And so ultimately, he was, we see that he was condemned by Catholics. We see the copies of Tyndale's Bible were burned, and so there was a lot of backlash to what he was doing. But we do have these copies, and he played a very important part in making these English translations, and ultimately playing an important part to what we have today. So we have John Wycliffe's translation in 1382. We see Erasmus printing the Greek in 1516, which leads to Tyndale's translation into English in 1526. And then, so we have a little bit more about what William Tyndale fought here. He was ultimately executed for his translation there. But we also have these other scriptures starting in the early 1500s. So the Coverdale Bible, we have Matthew's Bible in 1537. We have Taverner's Bible. We have the Great Bible, which is a revision of Matthew's Bible, which was, quote, authorized to be read in churches. We have the Geneva Bible in 1516, the Bishop's Bible in 1568, and the Rhymes Doe, I don't know how to say that, in somewhere around 1609 to 1610. Okay. So really starting in the 1500s, that's when we really start seeing these multiple translations. And if you remember your history, that's when we start, we're having the ability to print. And so the ability to make Bibles in large quantities. And so we see these translations become more and more prevalent here. And so this leads us to the King James Bible, which I guess anybody who owns a Bible, they're familiar with it. They're either probably reading their first Bible is probably either a King James or a New King James Version. And so we see that this translation, that it was, it was a very big undertaking. We see that there were 48 scholars that were going to translate the Bible. We see where we have these scholars that were separated into 6 companies, so eight men in each of these companies, and they were assigned specific books to translate. And we see ultimately that this translation was completed in 1611. Then we have a 1613 revision, and so this was a big deal here. And we see that it really became the preferred English translation. So it replaced the Bishop's Bible. It replaced the Geneva Bible as well. And so throughout time, we have these other English translations. I'm sure you're all familiar with these. We have the English Revised Version, 1885, American Standard Version in 1901. We have the Revised Standard Version in 1952. We have the New American Standard Bible, which I would, it's probably one of the more modern, popular translations. So 1963 and 1971 for that. And then we have the New International Version in 1973 and in 1978 as well. And so, going back to this, we'll went too far there. You know, again, going back to the beginning of the lesson, people just seemed like they have an idea that there's this huge gap between the King James and what was going on in the past. You know, we and kind of have an idea that they were just kind of, you know, doing their own little thing until we have the official King James translation there in 1611. But what we see is that we have information, we have scriptures, we have manuscripts, we have fragments that date back very, very early. So, over 1,000 years before the King James Bible. That again is painting the same picture. That the translations are telling the same thing. The books are similar. There are not gospels or verses in these versions that directly contradict one another. And we also have all of these manuscripts, thousands of manuscripts and thousands of fragments, and we see people looking at it, making sure that all these pieces are legitimate or whether they're not legitimate. And I think what we have to come to conclusion with is that the textual criticism of the Bible is unlike anything else in history. And for those that are questioning, well, whether or not the Bible is true or not, a lot of people will say, well, the Bible was corrupted throughout time. And so because of that, I really don't have to follow it. Maybe the original writings were true, but what we don't have is the original. And so therefore, I'm just not going to follow it at all. And my question to that is, how much more evidence do we need that we do have a consistent and accurate text? Now, I won't argue that there was a version that, that didn't have a typo, or maybe had just very, very slight difference from one manuscript to the other. But we have to recognize that those slight changes do not affect the meaning of those verses. It does not completely change doctrines. Even if it doesn't even change them at all. And so, how many documents do we need to back up the accuracy of any other book? Any other copy of any other book throughout time? What are the documents needed to back up the accuracy of it? How many witnesses do you need? How many people do you need saying, "Hey, this is legitimate. This is what these people were writing was true. I was a witness to this. We were all a witness to these things. So what basis do we have, or should we have, to determine if a book is accurate or not?" Because I think the information that we have right now, and at least all of the books, all of the manuscripts, I think they back up the legitimacy of the Bible. And so, really, what we come to here is that these writings were passed down accurately throughout time, and so what we get to is that we have two possibilities. And so these writings were passed down accurately, and so either we have to start at the very beginning and just say, okay, either what they wrote at the very beginning is true and legit, or what they wrote is, they actually did write this, but what they're writing is totally not true. All right, they were crazy. They were crazy and pulled off the greatest con job in the history of the world. Because I don't think that the argument of, well, the text was just corrupted I don't think it's a very good argument, not based on the evidence that we have. And so that's our only two choices that we have. And so this is the end of my lesson here. I hope that it's been useful. I think what we have to understand is that, we're not in the dark as far as the history of the Bible, specifically the New Testament. This is not, the New Testament was not just put together in some back room and then just handed to the ordinary people and told just to believe it. There's plenty and plenty of evidence that anybody who is searching for, they can look at it, they can search the evidence, and what you see is there's piles and piles of evidence for the consistency of the New Testament. I think what you get at that point is you're not necessarily questioning the text that we have today. What you should, I think, is more consistent is just question whether or not what is written there is just made up or not. And I think that's the question here. Either what they written is true, or what they written is just simply not true. They just made it all up. So if you got any questions or comments, feel free to leave that here, and I'll try to respond to that. As always, we also put these videos on our YouTube page. It's North Columbus Church of Christ, and you can find all of our old YouTube videos there. And love for you to subscribe to that. You'll be notified when we upload these videos at a later time. So until next time, I hope that you all have a good day and a good rest of the week. Thanks.